Hey everyone, I'm Jennifer Grossman. I'm CEO of the Atlas Society. I am joining you today from the set of our one of our upcoming Draw My Life videos. My name is Property. I wanted to introduce two of my heroes, two men I admire greatly, the founder of the Atlas Society, Professor David Kelley, as well as Assistant Professor Richard Salsman at Duke University. And we are here to talk about a op-ed that was published last week. Ayn Rand has been trending more than recently on Twitter. And one of the reasons is that Paul Krugman is back at it again with his favorite hobby horse of bashing Ayn Rand. So Professor Salzman, if you would just set it up a little bit, you've been following this and commenting on it, and also have been following Krugman over the years and his favorite pastime of bashing Ayn Rand.
Yeah, for those of you who may not know, you probably do know, Krugman is a Nobel Prize winning economist, teaches at Princeton for many years. I think he's at the New School now in New York. So he won the Nobel Prize in '08. He's known for being a Keynesian, a very serious Keynesian, and basically an interventionist when it comes to economic policy. Now, over the years, he's taken various shots at what he calls the right wing, but then typically and specifically Ayn Rand, which in my judgment, we were just talking about this offline, is not necessarily a bad thing in this case to get this kind of publicity for Ayn Rand. Okay, so the October 22nd New York Times op-ed, he's a regular op-ed writer there, was titled, "How Many Americans Will Ayn Rand Kill?" So obviously a very provocative, possibly irresponsible title. But the subline was, interestingly, liberty doesn't mean freedom to infect other people. Now, the reaction to this was so severe that I discovered in less than a day, the headline was changed to "When Libertarianism Goes Bad." So they took out the line, "How many Americans will Ayn Rand kill?" But the Ayn Rand lines in the text of it are still there, so I'll just quote that. And by the way, the context here is he's just citing more and rising cases. Okay, I don't know if you know this, but the death rate is plummeting. There is no rising death rate. A death rate meaning deaths per infected people has plummeted in the US since May. So the peak was May. It was something like 6 parts. It's down to like 2.5 now. So that's been going down. He doesn't mention any of that. But in the lead up to just saying, well, there's more cases because there's way more testing, you must know that. He says, why does this keep happening? Why does America keep making the same mistakes? Donald Trump's disastrous leadership is, of course, an important factor, but I also blame Ayn Rand, or more generally, libertarianism gone bad, a misunderstanding of what freedom is all about. Now, I won't quote much more from it, but the other parts of it are a kind of an externality argument. So if you're an economist, you know this argument that it's like polluting. You don't have a right to pollute other people and cause them torts, cause them harms. That either has to be recompensed or something like that. So he says the same thing is true here. And certainly in the case of infectious disease, the whole point of an infectious disease is if you have it, you may give it to others. Now, he's an advocate of, I'm quoting here, quote, widespread mask wearing. I think he would mandate it, actually. But later, he also says that it doesn't make any sense for people who do not have the disease to wear a mask. He actually says it's really for purposes of you not infecting others. So that's somewhat of a contradiction. But this, I think on a broader scale, this is interesting because I think he's basically making a moral point. He's really upset, he has been for years, that Ayn Rand's arguments are largely moral for capitalism. She's no anarchist, we know that. So he's not really accusing her of saying there's a laissez-faire policy. That's not really her policy. And one more thing, and then I'll stop. Earlier in the summer, when there were debates about opening up the economy and stopping the lockdowns, he had a similar kind of op-ed. This one was called "The Cult of Selfishness is Killing America." And there the argument was, why are we opening the economy and placing wealth above health? So he had this kind of zero-sum antagonistic theme of wealth is greedy, or the pursuit of wealth is greedy, but the pursuit of health, especially public health, is altruistic. And why are we doing the greedy thing when we should be doing the altruistic thing? So that's my quick summary of Krugman. There's maybe more in there, but I thought I would stop, at least give you that base level of what he's saying.
David?
Yes, thank you, Richard. that opposition between wealth and health. That's the simplest formulation. I didn't know Krugman had actually used that, but I mean, that's all over the media, and it's all over Biden's campaign right now.
Yeah.
And to me, that's a false dichotomy, because there are severe health consequences to the lockdowns on top of the disease.
Yeah.
And but we should be clear that Rand, nothing in Rand's thought, and certainly on my understanding of objectivism, says that the government has no role in the case of an infectious disease. I mean, the whole principle of that the objectivist political philosophy is based on is that no one has a right to impose physical harm on other people. And even when it's unintentional, as with infection, and it's not a matter of beating someone over the head with a crowbar, it is still, actionable by government. And, but, like everything else the government that we can allow the government to do, the burden is on showing why it's necessary. We don't just assume government's going to fix our problems. And part of the wider context here is that Krugman is, I think, playing to, is that so many people have now bought into that assumption. The entire healthcare system, this is the wider context that he doesn't address, but the entire healthcare system has relieved so many people of responsibility.
Yeah.
That they're claiming freedom, which is good, but they're not taking the responsibility that goes along with it. So I think, in a sense, he's almost got a case here that people are acting irresponsibly, assuming that there is scientific evidence, which I can't speak to, good solid evidence to support mask wearing and social distancing. But the consequences of this lockdown, which are, the action of locking down the economy is just unprecedented. And the closest I can think of would be World War II, when they just, in effect, turned all production over to military stuff. But even then, people were working. And the loss of wealth, the loss of hope, and on top of which there are health consequences from people not getting treatment they need, are a context that Krugman and many others simply ignore. And Rand would never do that. I mean, what's going on now is way, way beyond what anything that objectivism could sustain.
It's interesting that part of the focus of Krugman's critique was the statement, the Great Barrington Statement, from an organization I know that you are associated with, Professor Salsman, which is AIER.
Yeah.
And if they have a hallowed saint in their pantheon, it would be more Ludwig von Mises. Of course, we did the My Name is Ludwig von Mises in part in coordination with that organization. So why do you think it is that he didn't say how many Americans will Ludwig von Mises kill? And if you would, Professor Salzman, for the record, why don't we just correct what was Ayn Rand's position on quarantine with infectious diseases for which there is no inoculation, which I think that Krugman mischaracterizes.
Yeah, by the way, I think the Ayn Rand killing, it's totally the caricature of self-interest as brutal, running roughshod over others. And he associates Rand right with that, or wants to. He probably knows better, but he knows that people will fall for this. So that's the purple language. I think the purple language comes from, hey, we're not just talking about minimum wage laws and how they distort the economy. This is what the Mises, Hayek, and others focused on mostly. And Professor Kelley's right. Rand specifically focused on the egoistic basis for capitalism. So I think that's one of the reasons he would put her in there and really try to smear her with the idea of killing. And, this might interest the audience. Yeah, so this is straight from, I'm just quoting from Ayn Rand. This is a Q&A 1963, exactly on this topic, which is interesting. So she was asked, I don't have the question in front of me, but here's the answer. The next question, she's quoting now Rand, in regard to quarantine. So she actually got a question on quarantining. If someone has a contagious disease against which there's no inoculation, then the government will have the right to require quarantine. What is the principle here? It's to protect those people who are not ill, to protect the people to prevent the people who are ill from passing on their illness to others. Here you are dealing with a demonstrable physical damage. Remember that in all issues of protecting someone from physical damage, before a government can properly act, there has to be a scientific, objective demonstration of an actual physical danger. If it is demonstrated, then the government can act to protect those who are not yet ill from contracting the disease. In other words, to quarantine the people who are ill is not an interference with their rights. It is merely preventing them from doing physical damage to others. So, unquote. So, first of all, we don't have to take this as necessarily authoritative. I wanted to just read it into the record because, amazing as she was, she opined on a range of things, and this is straight to the point of Krugman, right? It's not a laissez-faire approach, and I've read this 3 or 4 times now. It's not only not laissez-faire, complete hands-off, but it's also not very invasive. I mean, it does not require, none of this says do a lockdown. None of this says mandatory testing for everyone even. You'd have to get some kind of testing, I say, to see who is actually carrying the disease, but it's a fairly limited government role, but it is a government role, we can tell. So I just wanted to read that into the record. I don't know what you think of that, David.
Yeah, and David, also we have a comment from one of our participants, Richard Brilliant, says that Krugman's argument is an argument from intimidation. If you disagree with the progressive agenda, they'll say you're responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths. How would you break it down sort of philosophically in terms of the techniques that Krugman is using here?
Well, it's a good observation from Rich. I see your name. And thank you for that. I was going to say Richard's point about quoting the passage from Ayn Rand that he read. That shows that Krugman did not do his homework. He was a sloppy journalist. I'm sure it's not the first time. I'm not a fan or a regular reader. But the argument from intimidation, yeah, you could definitely parse the argument that way, because he's not just he's not making an argument about what, or he makes in the later part of the essay a sketchy argument why he thinks the government should require mask wearing and social distancing and so forth, which raises another issue I want to get to. But he's just saying that if you disagree, you are, the implication is saying how many deaths. I mean, that's an absurd statement. No one person, except maybe Stalin, is directly responsible for that many deaths. It's because of all the people who accepted Rand, and all the ways in which it was fractured and refracted through various government actions. And it's happening in a context where our country is not, not even close to the ideal free society that Rand sketched. So, yeah, if we ask why did he do that, it is intimidating. I mean, you could call it a giant non sequitur, but it looks a lot like intimidation. Thanks for the comment.
We have another comment. Hey, Larry Borland is here, and he points out, of course, the current lockdowns, unlike what Ayn Rand is talking about, have in some states and localities locked down citizens who are not, infected, locking everyone down indiscriminately, rather than sort of a focused approach, which I think the Great Barrington Declaration recommends.
It might also be interesting to note, I found last summer a fascinating article in the New York Times that basically said the lockdown technique, if you want to call it that, was medieval. It was pre-Enlightenment. It was the idea of, oh my God, what is this thing? Let's run and hide. Versus, what is this thing? Let's find out what it is. Let's isolate it. Let's get a vaccine. Let's be rational about it. So the very thing Krugman is complaining about, qua Ayn Rand, this advocate of reason, science, objectivity, and the Enlightenment, he advocates the medieval approach. He advocates the authoritarian lockdown get scared approach, not even looking at the data of plummeting fatality rates, not looking at, by the way, I did not know of that Ayn Rand quote on infectious diseases. I found it in 5 minutes on the internet when I heard about the Krugman essay. So Krugman could have found that in 5 minutes, right? If he was typing out something on Ayn Rand, and he might have said, gee, I wonder if Ayn Rand said anything about it. It took me 2 minutes. I had no idea she had that view. It's the first time I read it. So that's another implication, indictment, I think, of his approach.
I want to just add something to Richard's point. I hadn't seen that article about the medieval character of the lockdowns, but there's a much more general point here, is that the term progressive is a complete floating concept. Actually, progressives are advocating something very regressive, right? I mean, government control, government allocation has been the history of mankind until the Enlightenment.
Yeah, and as you mentioned earlier, David, also I'm thinking, how about the FDA, CDC, Health and Human Services, all the range of ways that the government at the federal level, certainly it's also at the state level, what the monstrosities that Governor Cuomo imposed on nursing homes and things like that. I mean, to the extent those institutions messed up, Krugman and others should be questioning whether those are proper government roles. Johns Hopkins University, if you know, has been collecting data on this. So it's not as if private institutions can't handle this kind of thing. Certainly we're waiting for vaccines from whom? The FDA or from Pfizer and the for-profit vaccine companies. So if Krugman is looking for an Ayn Rand argument, I mean, she would be arguing for, yes, the science and free markets and profit seeking would solve this. And maybe the FDA and CDC are getting in the way, and the Faucis of the world aren't helping because it's one size fits all. There's no criticism from Krugman on that score.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of a limited government approach, the choice of doing one thing is always the choice of not doing another thing. And as we pointed out in My Name is Coronavirus, if we look to all of the various factors that have contributed to this very tragic and unfortunate situation, one of them is that if the CDC had one role, one responsibility, which was being on top of infectious diseases, they were off, fighting vaping. They were off fighting gun epidemics, and as a result, they were not giving priority to, if they had one responsibility, that's what it should have been.
Right. And there are examples around the world. Taiwan is probably the best example of a country that handled this very well, and it wasn't very invasive. They never did lockdowns. They did have immediate available testing, but apparently they'd been used to that in the past with the swine flu and various other things. So now if the CDC, if I recall right out of the bat, the CDC tests didn't work. The CDC pulled a bunch of tests off the shelf and they were useless.
Yeah, they were. There was some error in the manufacturing, and the clinics that got them had to send them back, saying these are useless. So
let me ask you, David. David, do you think it was proper? Now here's a case of government intervention. Do you think it was proper for Trump, this was January 31, to stop incoming flights from China?
I have to think about it. Like everything else that involves the government, I don't like it a priori, but I'm open to an argument that this was helpful. Necessary. Yeah. And the government has some role in also in travel to and from this country.
Yeah.
Right, our borders, not the immigration lock shutdowns that Trump is advocating, but control, knowing who's in the country, and I mean, if we were just talking about immigration, forget the COVID,
right.
Let's say anyone should be free to come here, but except terrorists, criminals, and people with infectious diseases.
Yeah, right. And so if they were flowing over the border, with malaria or something like that, no one. And you could demonstrate it. Probably no one who would object to that. And the same, so a flight coming into LaGuardia is the same thing. I remember he was opposed at the time. For the most part, he got opposition in January for doing that it was considered authoritarian and premature.
Yeah, and of course he was criticized by Biden, who called it xenophobic and racist. But from an objectivist point of view, the government has three roles: protect our borders from threats, outside threats, and in this case, it's not a military invasion, but there was a health threat. Protect citizens and have a court system to adjudicate these things. So I definitely think that there's an argument that, at least in the initial phases when we're still trying to wrap our heads around what was happening, that it was probably an advisable thing to do.
Not to get too intramural about this, but it might interest you that you mentioned the people up at AIER, Jennifer.
Yes.
A couple of them said to me privately, and they're mostly free market libertarians, and they said, we've really been disappointed, Richard, about how silent libertarians have been about this whole thing, especially somewhat accepting of lockdowns and things like that. On the other hand, I had this theory that, suppose you had a theory that the state really should do nothing. So you bordered on anarchist view. And so they see the problem is not statism, but the state itself, right? They wouldn't approve of anything that the government did here, right? And that wouldn't be Ayn Rand's view. On the other hand, to totally accede to what the government's doing because you have no opinion on the matter, that seems wrong as well. But so there's even, I think, within the liberty movement, kind of interesting gradations and differences between how conservatives, objectivists, and libertarians would handle this. A little intramural, but might be interesting to the audience.
Well, they've been a great partner to us at Stringham. Obviously, just came out for our gala, made the trip across the country,
Good.
and just the gala is an example. We held an in-person event. It's the first in-person event that I know of that hasn't been canceled. There is, and was that just totally cowboy? No, I mean there were these very state-of-the-art masks that are designed for athletic performance and that are highly graded. We had not mandatory testing, but we had rapid antigen testing of, I think, the 140 people that came to the gala. Nearly all were tested and not one tested positive. We had social distancing. So I think in the midst of all of this, it is important to realize that there are ways. We can do it. We can do it. We can find a way. And it may not, it's not a one size fits all. You have to kind of tailor it to your different populations. If you have an event that's all students, that's one thing. If you have an event that's in one state, that's another thing. So it's possible, but AIER really deserves a lot of kudos. Jeffrey Tucker, John Tamney, who we had on the show, you, Professor Salsman, I think have done a lot by prioritizing this. We're all talking about different issues. The Atlas Society obviously focuses more on philosophy, in particular objectivism, but AIER, very early on said this is going to be our priority. We are not going to let up, and I think that's been really important. They've taken a lot of heat, but they have been very vocal, where unfortunately a lot of libertarians have been silent.
Yeah. In many ways, this whole incident is a real great test of knowledge of epistemology, to the extent it affects the epidemiology. So there's all sorts of debates about that, right? Are we looking at the right numbers? Are we assessing it the right way? How do we gauge risk? But it also has this element of the proper role of government. So it has both of those things, which objectivism can uniquely address. It's fascinating in many ways.
We have a question from Larry Borland. He wants to know, was Krugman's op-ed a overall plus for objectivism? I think we kind of touched on this earlier.
You take that, David.
Yeah, all right, we did touch on it. Richard did, and we were discussing this beforehand. It's a smear. And so you think, well, that's unjust, it's unfair, it's, one of decades of smears against Ayn Rand.
Yeah.
Which is why we're producing a new version of our book, Myths About Ayn Rand. Maybe we'll use this one. But on the other hand, they say banned in Boston is good for a show. When you get negative attention from someone that is, widely known as a liberal in this case, and Ayn Rand is still getting under his skin. It wasn't. I think your example, Richard, was it wasn't how many people did Friedrich von Hayek kill, or Ludwig von Mises. No, it was Ayn Rand, and I think the answer is pretty clear. Why, even all these decades after she passed away, and half a century since Atlas Shrugged, I think it's because she opposed the left, not just on economic grounds, saying it wouldn't work, or the minimum wage is, going to cost jobs instead of raise wages. No, she said, you guys are evil. You're not the good guys. You are, if you think you are, have the moral high ground, you have a lot to show, because you've caused destruction. You've squelched individual freedom. You're not good. And when you criticize the underlying moral foundations of a point of view, especially a point of view that has occupied the moral high ground, for such a long time, I think that's something that just cannot stand. And that's why Ayn Rand is still the bloody flag they wave when they want to attack libertarians or liberty or individualism.
And I totally agree with that, David. And the other thing I notice is, just for the semi-alert or just semi-sentient, the cartoonish caricature of self-interest as, oblivious to all around you. Isn't it in someone's self-interest not to be infected with a disease? And then further, suppose you had it. Isn't it in your self-interest not to give the disease to those you love? Your circle are people you work with, your family, your friends. It's not usually not total strangers. And so there isn't even, I don't think, the obvious should be obvious, right? No self-interest in wanting to infect that group is certainly. So it doesn't even fit just standard, rational self-interest tests. So it's a caricature, right? The self-interested person is irrational, myopic, sadistic. It's just so cartoonish that it makes, I think, if anyone looks at it, makes him look foolish. They know that can't be Ayn Rand's view. I think they know that.
I hope so.
Well,
but I just a point to add to what Richard was saying. When people who know anything about economics know that trade is generally win-win, both sides benefit. And the entire science is based on that. But when they start thinking about morality, even sophisticated economists like Krugman, they revert to a pre-Enlightenment view of, there's one big pot, my gain is your loss.
Yeah.
So it's bizarre.
Well, I will say this as we're closing up, and I want to thank both of you guys for just jumping on and answering a few questions and setting the record straight in terms of what Ayn Rand actually said on record about quarantines. But I will say this, that over the 30 years that I have been driving around with my Ayn Rand license plate, I have gone from, people keying my car and giving me the finger to about 4 or 5 years ago, or maybe longer than that. And that's when I started with the Atlas Society. I had seen that I stopped getting, the angry looks that people would just say, "What is that? And is that your name?" That they didn't understand what it was. And for me, it was like, wow, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to reintroduce Ayn Rand to
Yeah.
people and to define the narrative. So it's been great, and I don't know. I guess have to thank Paul Krugman a little bit for the phenomenal new interest in Ayn Rand among all of the students that we see. And also, I'm just going to sign off with showing you guys the set of
Oh, yeah.
our Draw My Life.
No,
Yeah.
Hey, Adam, say hi.
hey, we have the artist too.
We have the artist
Yeah.
right here.
Having fun.
And
Yeah.
we have the crew. Yeah.
They all.
Hey,
So anyway, great to see you guys. And
Thank you for having me. Thank
yeah,
you, David.
thanks.
thank you. Thank you everyone for arranging it.
Okay, bye.
Bye.